Hello guys and welcome to the Budding Watch Enthusiast. So James Bond, 007. For me, probably the most important character in cinema history for me personally. Just because that James Bond movies and the James Bond character have had such an influence on me just in terms of my interest in film, in terms of my interest in style, and yes, my interest in watches as well. Hugely influenced originally by James Bond. I don't know if there's a character in film that has been more influential in the wristwatch world than James Bond, because over the past 24 movies, Bond is known just as much for his watches as almost anything else about that character. So there's tons of James Bond watches to choose from. Today I'm going to be giving you my top 5 James Bond watches of all time and telling you why they're my favorite. Before we get started, quick wristwatch check. I am wearing the Casio World Time, aka the Casio Royale, a watch that is hugely influenced, I think, by one of the watches on this list, or at least watch nerds closely tie them together, even if they don't necessarily belong together. But we will get into that later on. And by the way, guys, even though I do know a lot of this stuff because I'm just a huge James Bond fan, off the top of my head anyway, I did source some information and a lot of the images for this video from an article on a website called TimepieceChronicle.com. I will link the full article in the description below. I do encourage you to check it out. Especially if you're a James Bond fan, because they do a very thorough job of listing all of the James Bond watches that he wears throughout the films. It's a great article. Highly recommend you check it out. So here we go, the top 5 James Bond watches of all time. So number 5 is the Breitling Top Time, the reference 2002 that Bond wears in Thunderball. Now, this watch I love almost as much for the story that's surrounded the watch since the movie came out, as much as I do the watch itself. As far as the watch itself goes, the Top Time is a 2-register chronograph watch. It does contain the venerable Valjoux 7730 chronograph movement. What's interesting about this watch, too, is that technically it's the first gadget watch in the Bond films. Up to this point, Sean Connery has pretty much exclusively worn Rolex Submariners. To this point in the film franchise, he's also worn a gold Gruen for a little bit in Dr. No. But this is the first time that Bond gets a gadget watch, because the Breitling Top Time in the film is outfitted with a custom case that's in the film supposed to be a Geiger counter that he can use to measure radiation as he looks for nuclear weapons. What's interesting about this is that the watch was lost to time after the filming was over until 2013, when it basically popped up at the equivalent of like a yard sale in Britain, and it was sold for £25, or like, I don't know, $35 basically, to somebody who then sent it off to Breitling. Not only was it verified as, you know, obviously a authentic Breitling Top Time, but it was the Breitling Top Time used in Thunderball. And of course, the watch was then sold at auction for much, much more, over 5 figures. So just a really interesting story as far as that goes. It's a fantastic looking chronograph, even with that giant bulky case on it. And Breitling, I don't know if they paid like any kind of licensing fees or something in Thunderball, but they show up twice because Francois Derval also is wearing a Breitling Navitimer in the film as well. So the Breitling Top Time is my number 5. Number 4 is the Rolex Submariner, the reference 5513 that is worn by Roger Moore in both Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. This particular Rolex sub is probably the only vintage Submariner that I would ever consider buying if I were ever in the market for a vintage Submariner. They tend to be of the cheaper ones that are out there. I mean, it still costs, you know, easily close to 10 grand for one. But in terms of, you know, how much vintage subs go for, it's on the lower end of the scale, probably because this particular reference was manufactured for almost 30 years before Rolex moved on to another model. I'm a big fan of this one. I prefer the no date look of the Rolex Submariner. This one, of course, does not have a date. This does contain the Rolex Caliber 1520 movement inside of it. So the Breitling Top Time was the first time that Bond had a gadget incorporated with his watch. This is the first time that this is a legit gadget watch. They, of course, made multiple different custom versions of this Submariner for the film, one of which that you see when Bond turns the bezel. It turns all of the markers on the watch red because that, of course, activates the magnet in the watch that allows him to attract magnetic objects to it. And then, of course, this is also the one that has the buzzsaw bezel that Bond can activate. And I think Rolex actually has this because they posted on Instagram a couple of years ago with this watch with the buzzsaw bezel that was still functional. So if you are a fan of the gadget watches, this is probably the most popular one. But I do just love the look of this Submariner, classic style for me. I'm not a big fan of having a date on a Rolex sub, so this is my number 4 choice for James Bond. Number 3 is the Seiko G757 Sports 100 that is worn by Roger Moore in Octopussy. Now I can almost hear the cries like, "Oh no, a digital watch on the best of Bond list." Yeah, I can't help it, guys. I really am taken with this watch. Of course, Roger Moore is the only James Bond to ever wear a digital watch. He wore several of them throughout filming, mostly Seikos. This is the one that I think is the coolest because it looks the most to me like a spy's watch. The gadget that's contained in this one is a homing tracker that Roger Moore is able to use to track the location of the Fabergé egg MacGuffin that exists throughout the film of Octopussy. But this watch is also the watch that watch nerds tie most closely with this one, the Casio World Time. It's why we call it the Casio Royale. The two watches obviously are not identical, but they do have some striking similarity in their visual design. Yeah, I'm never one that's minded James Bond wearing a digital watch. In that era, in the late 70s and early 80s, it certainly would make sense. And I also prefer my Bond with a classic analog watch on his wrist, if possible. But I understand why the film producers made that choice. It would make sense that Bond would have a digital watch at that time. So it's something I've never had an issue with. And of all of the different digital watches that Bond did use, this is easily my favorite. So number 3, the Seiko G757. Number 2 is actually the most recent watch that, as of this recording, that James Bond has worn, and that is the Omega Seamaster 300 Spectre edition that Bond wore, of course, in the film Spectre. James Bond, of course, has shifted to Omega, starting with Pierce Brosnan's run as Bond after using primarily Rolexes. The reason that I love this Seamaster the most over the other Seamasters that Bond has used in his films is because this one has the most vintage styling. This one looks sort of similar to the Seamaster 57 reissue that Omega did a while back. It is powered by the Caliber 8400 Master Coaxial movement that, of course, is exclusive to Omega. The feature of this watch that I love to bits is it has the 12-hour second time zone bezel around the outside instead of a traditional dive time bezel, the poor man's GMT, as it were. I don't know why more dive watches don't incorporate the second time zone bezel instead of a diver's bezel. I mean, I understand why the dive time bezel's on there. It's because that's traditionally what you find on a dive watch. But I feel like in this day and age where everyone wears dive watches, even, and I would say the vast majority of people that wear divers don't actually dive with them, a 12-hour second time zone would be a far more useful use of the bezel, I think, for most people. I don't know why this isn't incorporated in more dive watches. If you're making dive watches, especially micro brands out there, consider the 12-hour GMT bezel instead of the dive time bezel. I think it would be great. But I love the fact that James Bond has this. Now that I think about it, it is a little weird that James Bond has never worn a GMT. He never wore a Rolex GMT. He never wore a Seamaster GMT at all. Isn't that kind of weird? Like, James Bond goes all over the world. You would think that a GMT watch would be super useful for a spy like him. But again, I love the 12-hour timing bezel on this. It makes complete sense for James Bond to have it. And a fun fact that this Omega Seamaster 300 is the only time that James Bond has ever worn a watch that was then later sold as a limited edition. Typically, all the watches that James Bond have worn beforehand were just regular edition watches that anyone could go out and buy that were part of the regular line. The Spectre version is, of course, a movie tie-in for Spectre that was available in limited numbers. It, of course, comes on the Bond-style NATO strap as well. So yes, number 2, my favorite Seamaster of all the James Bond Seamasters, the Omega Seamaster 300 Spectre Edition. And number 1, could there really have been any other choice but the Rolex Submariner, the reference 6538 that is worn by Sean Connery in Dr. No through Thunderball? I mean, this is the watch that everybody points to when you talk about the James Bond watch. It's arguably one of the most famous watches in film cinema history. It is, of course, the watch that gets the greatest watch close-up in all the Bond films, as Bond is, looking at his watch, checking the timer of when a bomb that he planted is going to go off in Goldfinger. Yeah, this is the sub that just when you see it for the first time, it just speaks to you. And this was, the watch that kind of made me interested in learning more about watches. It is, of course, powered by the Rolex Caliber 1030 movement. This reference is also extremely rare. It routinely gets over 6 figures when sold at auction. So unless you are incredibly independently wealthy, I wouldn't plan on picking this one up anytime soon. This was also the first Rolex Submariner that was rated for 200-meter water resistance. All previous ones before that had only been 100-meter water resistance rated. And funnily enough, this watch is also most famous probably for the fact that Sean Connery wears it on a fabric strap that is far too short for the lug width of this watch. The lug width on this watch is 20 millimeters. I think the fabric strap that he wears is like 16 millimeters. It's kind of bizarre how short it is. And it's not just an accident in Goldfinger either, because you do get to see the same strap worn on it in Thunderball as well when he wears this watch too. The 5513 I don't think is as highly regarded among Bond fans because it is a gadget watch when you first see it in Live and Let Die. For this one, this is the one that people see and it screams James Bond. Like, it is the quintessential Bond watch. It's just a fantastic looking watch. Even when you see it in that close-up in Goldfinger, it looks well worn in. It looks, has a vintage charm to it, certainly. It's the watch that inspired watch strap fashion. Of course, the Bond-style NATO strap and the green Bond-style NATO strap is probably the most popular style of NATO strap that's sold today, I would imagine. Like I said, it's one of the watches that really got me interested to learn more, which eventually led me to doing this channel. So it's fair to say that without that Rolex sub, I might not be here talking to you today. I love this watch. It's fantastic. I'll never own one day unless I fall over like a plutonium mine somewhere, and that's okay. But I will always appreciate it and love seeing it. So that is it. That is my top 5 James Bond watches of all time. A couple honorable mentions that did make the cut. I do also enjoy the Pulsar Timekeeper from Live and Let Die that Roger Moore wears at the beginning of the film. I do like the Rolex chronograph that George Lazenby wears in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, a very underrated watch in terms of the Bond history, a forgotten watch, you could say. And I also like the Seamaster Professional that Pierce Brosnan wears in GoldenEye. Even though it is a quartz watch, it's pretty cool having the laser that comes out of the lume pip on the bezel. Probably my favorite Bond gadget watch. I'd be curious to know what your favorite James Bond watch is. Maybe I didn't mention it. Maybe you agree with one of my choices. Hit the comments section below and let me know. Thank you guys very much for watching. You can do me a huge favor by hitting the like button if you found this video informative or entertaining. Also, if you are new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for stopping by. Hit that red subscribe button down there and ring the bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I post a new video. And if you don't follow me on Instagram, please swing on by. at Budding Watch Enthusiast. Give me a follow there. I am always posting wrist shots and other fun stuff there as well. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I will see you the next time.